a mask hidden where no light dares to reach what truth waits above. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. Share the intrigue. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Now, the story begins. London's fog lay upon Baker Street like a shawl flung carelessly across a chair, thin in places, thick in others, and catching at the lamps so that each seemed a haloed star hung too low for comfort. Watson, who had seen the city in every temperament from roaring noon to sullen midnight, thought the morning's gloom unusually theatrical, as if the town itself were conspiring to set a stage. The effect was not wasted upon Sherlock Holmes. He sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug with the poker across his knees, and his grey eyes narrowed, as though all the clouds had been invited in to be examined and were now obliged to perform. I had scarcely divested myself of my greatcoat when Mrs. Hudson opened the door, with that peculiar restraint which in her amounted to an alarm bell. "Inspector Lestrade, sir," she announced, and then, dropping to a whisper she could not help, "and another gentleman who looks as if he has not slept." Lestrade entered briskly, his hat in hand and little rivulets of moisture tracking down his coat from the fog. He was followed by a narrow, well-dressed man of middle years whose cravat had been tied by habit rather than attention. The knot had slipped, the cambric was creased, and his eyes, remarkably dark, were rimmed with red. The man's hand clutched a rolled paper as one clutches a railing in a heave of the sea. "Holmes," Lestrade began without ceremony, "I am not ashamed to say I am at my wits' end at 10 in the morning. Sir Alister Grieve is dead, found in the attic of his house in Montague Street. There are circumstances, well, you'll see. The yard is at sea and no mistake." Holmes uncoiled himself like a spring returning to rest and waved the inspector and our visitor toward the chairs by the fire. "Mr. Holmes," the stranger said with a sudden rush of voice, "I am Joseph Grieve, brother to the late Sir Alister. I beg you, if there is any quickness to be brought to this miserable tangle, bring it." Holmes took the paper from the man's hand and smoothed it against his knee. It proved to be a rough plan drawn in pencil, its lines energetic but competent. The top floor of a house, with a narrow landing, 2 bedrooms, a water closet, and at the end a square marked ATTIC trap and ceiling cord beside it. In a different hand, firmer official, someone had written, "Door locked, window nailed, key inside." "Lestrade," said Holmes, "permit Mr. Grieve to tell his story as he experienced it. Then you shall add the yard's embroidery." Joseph Grieve swallowed. Alister had not been himself these past months. He fancied he was watched. It is a ludicrous thing to say of a man who commanded a battalion in the Crimea, but there it is. He would send his valet away on errands at unreasonable hours, and this will sound mad, spend long stretches in the attic, which he had lately cleared of trunks and rubbish. Yesterday evening he sent word to me that he had made an acquisition of singular interest. "We are work electors, Mr. Holmes." My brother inclined to the grotesque. "Masks, puppets, odd carvings from fairs and carnivals, anything with a face." I arrived at 9. He was not in his study. The housemaid said he had gone up to see to the drafts. That was a phrase of his. Grieve's voice caught. He continued more quietly, "We waited. He did not come down. At last we went up. The landing was cold, bitterly cold, though the house was warm below. The cord to the attic trap was hanging down. We pulled it. The trap fell open, and God forgive me, he fell with it. He dropped at our feet like a marionette cut loose, and over his face, over his poor dear face, was a white mask, a plain, blank mask, such as mummers wear, tied at the back with ribbon. He had no breath. The doctor said his heart." Here Grieve's composure deserted him. He bowed his head and pressed his fingers hard upon his eyes. Lestrade took up the account. "Dr. Hargreaves is a respectable man and believes in hearts. I believe in ropes and blades until proved otherwise. The body shows no mark, no bruise, no cut. The ribbon about the head was knotted behind. It was not tight enough to strangle. There is no trap or contrivance that we can find in the attic, no spring, no weight, nothing. The trapdoor opens on hinges. The cord is common. And yet look at your plan, Mr. Holmes. The attic hatch was flush with the ceiling when we went up the first time, and the door to that landing there was locked on the inside. The window at the end is nailed. The key to the door lay inside the lock. Unless ghosts have learned locksmithing, we have a puzzle." Holmes had been very still. Now he took the poker in both hands, as if the metal could be made to answer. "The attic," he said, "had lately been cleared. So the servants say," Lestrade replied. "Bare boards, a couple of old chairs, and against the far wall, a trunk that had belonged to the baronet's father, a military man. Oh, and this." He reached into his coat and produced a small paper packet which he set upon the table. "A scrap taken from the ribbon of the mask. It smells, if you please, like a lady's boudoir." Holmes unfolded the paper, lifted the scrap, and brought it to his nose with a delicacy that would have done credit to a vicar at the altar. He turned his head a fraction, as if listening to an echo. "Violets," he said, "but not the flower. The artificial essence favored by actresses and their admirers. It is not common in respectable drawing-rooms." Grieve flinched as though the remark had contained an accusation. "My brother was a collector," he repeated, but the protest rang thin. "Tell me," said Holmes, "of this acquisition he boasted of." Grieve shook his head. He would not say. only that it completed a set which had haunted him since youth. A foolish phrase, and yet he used it. He asked me to bring him a certain ledger, the catalogue of his private purchases, but when I arrived he had already sent his valet to fetch it from a dealer in Drury Lane. He said he must see how the new piece compared with the old. I never learned what it was. At what hour did Sir Alister go to the attic? Holmes asked. 9 precisely, said Grieve. He carried a candle lamp and his cane, though he had no lameness. Where are the lamp and the cane now? The lamp lay overturned near the trunk, Lestrade said. Out, but not broken. There's a smear of soot on the trunk lid, and a curious half-moon of it on the floorboards a yard off, as if someone pressed the lamp glass there. The cane is nowhere to be found. Ah, Holmes's eyelids drooped. And footprints. Dust enough to show if there had been a dance, the inspector admitted. But the boards were swept. Still, we have a few traces. A smudge by the trap, some powder here and there, fine dark, like blacking, but gritty. The housemaid swears she scrubbed no later than yesterday afternoon. Watson, who had been content to watch the interplay Holmes's mind catching and releasing details as a skilled angler plays a fish, felt a queer chill at the picture formed by those simple facts. The empty attic, the blank mask, the fallen baronet. It was not horror in the common sense, but the uncanny suggestion of a face imposed on a face in a theatre above a gentleman's chamber. London had 1,000 such little stages where vice and whimsy strutted. That one should be set in Montague Street troubled him. Holmes rose and crossed to the window as if the fog outside might condescend to assist. He stood very straight, the poker still in his hand, then turned with abrupt decision. We shall go at once, he said. The dead man does us the courtesy of brevity, and we must answer in kind. Lestrade, have your constable keep the household from tiding a single mote of dust. Mr. Grieve, you will come. Dr. Watson here, he gave me a look that was almost mischievous. Bring your stethoscope. Not for the dead, but for the living. I fancy this case will quicken more than one heart. As he reached for his coat, Holmes paused and tapped the rolled plan with the poker tip. One thing more. The ribbon of the mask cut or torn. Torn, said Lestrade. Jagged, but only at one end. The other is neatly trimmed. Excellent. Then the mask was tied upon Sir Alister with a ribbon that had been shortened in haste. A woman's impatience or a man's lack of needle. Either way, we have in our hand a thread which, if drawn slowly, may strip the whole thing bare. His gaze softened for a moment upon our visitor. Courage, Mr. Grieve. The blankest faces are often those that hide the most expression. We shall see what your brother was compelled to look upon in his last minute, and who compelled him. The cab that bore us toward Montague Street rattled as though eager to arrive. Holmes sat forward, fingers steepled, the poker exchanged for his lean forefinger with which he sketched invisible lines upon his knee. A square of boards, a hatch, a trunk, a half-moon of soot, a missing cane, and that plain white mask. At a corner, the cab jolted over a rut and a little box slid from beneath the opposite seat to knock against Watson's boot. He stooped and retrieved it. It was a narrow tin of the sort used for theatrical grease paint, its lid smeared to a dull sheen and carrying, faintly, that same violet note. Holmes took the tin, and his mouth thinned to that dangerous line which meant he had smelled a trail. So, he murmured, almost to himself, if the attic was a stage, we must discover who wrote the part and why a gentleman was chosen to play it with his life for an audience of none. Montague Street received us with the hush peculiar to houses where death has lately sat. Even the knocker had the air of a hand withdrawn. A pale but competent butler admitted us to a hall of polished wood and the subdued light of good taste. Lestrade dispatched his constable to keep the doors, and Holmes, without so much as a glance at a portrait or chair-leg, went straight to the narrow stair which led to the upper floor. We climbed, Mr. Joseph Grieve clinging to the banister as if to an argument he could still win with himself. On the landing the cold struck us at once, a sullen draught that crept at ankle and wrist. The door at the end, giving on the attic stair, stood open now, but the window beyond remained shut and nailed, as the plan had promised. Holmes crouched, put 2 fingers upon the boards, and then upon the inner face of the door, and finally upon the iron of the key still thrust within. He straightened, and I saw that his fingertips were smudged with a fine black dust, not greasy like soot but faintly gritty, as if it held some minute crystals. Your housemaid speaks truth of her scrubbing, he said. The dust you did not intend to have, I value the more. He mounted the 3 steps to the trap, worked the cord, and let the square of ceiling fall. Hinges sighing. A short stair within plain, steep, of new timber led to the little void under the roof. He went up as a cat goes up a fence, light and certain. I followed, then Lestrade, then our client, who paused at the threshold as men do at the door of a church. The attic was bare as described. Boards, 2 lame chairs, the long black trunk. The candle lamp lay on its side near that trunk, its glass chimney smirched with soot. Holmes did not touch it. He paced the perimeter with rapid, darting steps, pausing to bend at the window where 4 bright nails pinned the sash against its frame. He tried the cord of the trap from above, noting where it hung when the hatch was shut and how the knot had been made. He set his palm briefly upon the lid of the trunk. cold, he observed. But whether he meant the trunk or the air that seemed to pool here I could not tell. Lestrade indicated the place where the body had fallen, and with his baton sketched the half-moon of black upon the boards a yard away. Your lamp-glass, Mr. Holmes pressed there, as if someone steadied himself with it. Though that makes no sense, it makes a better diagram than you suppose. Holmes returned, and knelt. He brought from his pocket a small magnifier and a sheet of white paper which he slipped beneath a crack. With the point of his penknife he teased a few black grains into view and onto the paper. They showed, like pepper upon snow. He touched one with his tongue, the barest kiss. Not soot alone. Lampblack adulterated with a mild abrasive. Emery, I think. Common on the benches of working jewelers and makers of automata where a fine finish is wanted on metal. Not commonly found in an attic. You think our man is a jeweler? Lestrade ventured. I think our stage manager has had a jeweler's bench near him. Or else he bought his paint from a player who uses what he has. Emery in Greece is not kind to skin. See here, he nodded toward a faint smear upon the trunk lid which, under the glass, showed the ghost of a fingertip abraded. A hurried hand, not a careful one. He turned to Mr. Grieve. Sir Alister's acquisitions are, any of them of metal, masks of tin or copper, hinged Grieve shook his head. Card, paper, match, carved wood. He despised the mechanical. Despised it, but collected the look of it. Holmes murmured. And last night he wished his valet to bring a ledger from a dealer in Drury Lane, at the theatre end. Lestrade put in. At the theatre end, Holmes agreed. He drew from his pocket the narrow tin which had slid under my boot in the cab and snapped its lid open. The faint violet note breathed up again, overlaying the mineral smell like compliment over insult. Grease paint. The lid is rubbed by a thumb used to the motion. Note the smear along the seam opened with a coin more than once. The taxi in which it rode to us this morning had a previous fare who left a tour. Someone placed it knowing we should ride. Either way, the theatre continues to send its visiting cards. You think this tin belonged to my brother? Grieve's voice was strained. Holmes's look was kind, but oblique. I think your brother was made to wear a mask, and someone somewhere lately reddened lips or whitened skin with this very compound. The perfume is no accident. Actresses favor it because the reek of tallow is less offensive. So veiled he set the tin aside, and surveyed the square of ceiling and the dangling cord. Inspector, oblige me by closing the hatch. Watson, stand beneath and watch my hands. He went down the stair, tugged the cord. The hatch rose and settled flush with a soft clap. He knotted the cord to a small ring screwed into the stair timber, so that it hung just out of reach unless one stood on the top step. Observe, he said, and with one of the lame chairs made a platform, then stood upon it and set the lamp upright at the spot of the half-moon, pressing its chin to the floor to leave the arc anew. A man of modest height could, standing thus, lift the hatch with one hand, steady himself with the other, leaving just such a crescent hand vanish upward with surprising speed if he had incentive. The question is not whether a man could go up, it is why a gentleman went down dead, his heart. As Dr. Hargreaves said. Lestrade muttered. Obstinate, possibly, said Holmes. He untied the cord. The hatch fell again with its sigh. But one does not tie a mask upon one's own face in extremis, nor shorten the ribbon in impatience. The knot behind was made by another's hand. Tell me of the ribbon. Lestrade opened his paper packet. Holmes examined the torn silk. A cheap ribbon, bought by the yard. Frayed at the cut end where the scissors were dolor. The hand, trembling, he folded it back. Mr. Grieve, who slept in the house last night. The household only, said Grieve. My brother in his room on the floor below. The valet Phelps, in the little chamber off the back stairs. The housemaid Annie, the cook and butler on the ground floor. I remained until after the surgeon came, and then Lestrade sent me away. Phelps, Holmes repeated. A useful man, quiet, efficient. My brother trusted him. Does he smell of violets? The question was so absurd that even Grieve, drugged as he was, blinked. He smells of nothing I can recall, he said. Then we will nose our quarry elsewhere, Holmes answered, and rose in one liquid motion. He crossed to the nailed window. These nails are bright. Knew who drove them. Phelps, said Lestrade. By order. Sir Alister had lately a mania for shutting out draughts, or for shutting in something, Holmes replied. He set his fingernail to the edge of one bright head and showed us, with a touch of triumph, the ring of dullarwood beneath, untarnished by air, driven after the sash was closed the last time, that is to say, very lately indeed. He lowered the hatch door too and looked once more around at the boards, and yet there are no prints to show a visitor's dance. Therefore our visitor is of the house, or walked as if he belonged to it. He led us down to the landing. The cold seemed less there, as if a door had been shut upon some unseen current. Holmes stood very close to the inner knob of the landing door and peered at the key's long bit. He bent again, brought out a short coil of frayed thread from the pocket of his dressing gown which he had somehow contrived to bring along, and fed the end into the keyhole, drawing it back with a look of satisfaction when it returned smudged. A film of grease within, he said. The key has been turned lately with aid, and from which side? That we shall persuade it to tell us in a moment. He turned, and his gaze, which had flown like a hawk around rafters and rings, settled at last upon me. Watson, you have your stethoscope. I have, I said, though I confess I had begun to fear he meant to auscultate the wood. Good, we will use it upon the living. Send me, if you please, Annie, the housemaid, and Phelps the valet together, and ask the butler for any parcel that arrived from Drury Lane yesterday evening. If there was none, ask him for the ledger that never came. Our stage waits upon its players, and I should like to hear how their hearts perform when the cue is given. The butler obeyed with the composure of one drilled in crises. Within moments he returned, Annie, the housemaid, following timidly. She was a slight creature, hair pulled too tight for her own comfort, hands folded and refolded as if to keep them from fidgeting. Holmes, who had contrived to look entirely idle by the fireplace, gestured her to a chair. "My good girl," he said with that deceptive mildness which was the forerunner of his keenest interrogations, "you scrubbed the attic floor yesterday." "Yes, sir. Sir Alister was particular about dust," said it. "Drew drafts." "Indeed. And did you see aught unusual when you finished?" Her eyes darted to Joseph Grieve, then back to her apron. "Only that Sir Alister brought up a parcel after, a small, wrapped in brown paper. He would not let me touch it. He said he had found something to complete his collection." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if confirming a note already in his score. "And last night did you hear steps after the household had retired?" "I thought," she faltered, then gathered herself. "I thought I heard someone on the back stairs, sir, but I told myself it was Phelps. He carries his shoes in his hand, often. Light steps like a woman's, but I was half asleep." Holmes drew out my stethoscope and, before the girl could protest, placed the discs gently against her wrist as she extended it. Bewildered, his face betrayed nothing, but he gave a faint hum when the rapid flutter met his ear. He dismissed her with courtesy, and she fled with relief visible in every motion. Next came Phelps, the valet, a man of 30, neat and almost excessively correct, his manner deferential without warmth. His dark hair was plastered to his skull with some tonic, and his suit bore that gloss which tells of scrupulous brushing. Holmes studied him with an air of indifference so consummate it could only be deliberate. "You served your master faithfully." "To the best of my powers." "Sir, you fetched him parcels yesterday." Phelps hesitated only the smallest instant. "Yes, from Mr. Sayer, the dealer in Drury Lane. A book, sir, bound ledger of purchases." Holmes showed him the narrow tin of grease. "Was this among them?" The valet's nostrils pinched. His composure did not slip. "I never saw it." Holmes bent forward suddenly, set the stethoscope to the man's wrist, and motioned me to listen. I pressed the instrument to my ears. At first the beat was steady, firm, but when Holmes said, almost idly, "And did the book contain mention of a mask, plain and white, marked with a number?" the pulse leaped beneath my fingers like a fish upon a line. "Enough," said Holmes softly, and released him. Phelps withdrew with rigid politeness, but I marked a glint of sweat upon his temple, though the room was cool. Joseph Grieve, pale but attentive, could restrain himself no longer. "Holmes, the man is guilty. His heart betrayed him." Holmes shook his head. "He is frightened, which is another thing. He may fear discovery of something less grave than murder, but damning in his station. We must not confuse terror with guilt. Yet the tremor tells us that the ledger he fetched has weight in this matter." Lestrade snapped his notebook shut. "We'll lay hands on that book at once." If he lies. Holmes interrupted. "He does so for reasons yet veiled. Arrest him now and we frighten the true culprit." "No, let him play his part a little longer. The stage is not ready." At that moment the butler returned with a package. It was a ledger bound in black, its edges thumbed by years of use. Holmes opened it delicately, leafing through the pages with long, pale fingers. The entries were neat, dated and initialed. Marionettes from fairs, grotesque visages from Italy, masks carved in ebony. Then, near the end, an entry in Sir Alister's hand, dated only 2 days past. "Mask of blank visage, white, origin uncertain, acquisition finally complete." Beside it, in smaller letters, was scrawled, numbered 3, I, 2, await the last. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he read it, though he gave no comment. He shut the book abruptly and returned it. "Gentlemen, our baronet has left us a riddle in Roman numerals. 3, 1, 2, yet he calls it the last. If we can discover the order of this grotesque set, we may also discover whose hand arranged the finale." Grieve leaned forward. "You mean he was killed for this mask?" "Not for the mask, but for what it represented," Holmes said. "Men do not risk rope and gallows for card and paint, but to conceal a secret, or to complete a vengeance, that is another matter." He turned to Lestrade. "We shall need a quiet word with Mr. Sayer in Drury Lane. He will know who brought such a mask to Sir Alister Lestrade." Lestrade grunted assent, but his brows were furrowed. "And in the meantime," said Holmes, "we observe, the household will betray itself by its ordinary acts, and I am curious what scent remains in that attic when night comes down, for it is at night, I think, that our phantom preferred to move." As we made our way from the chamber, Holmes touched my arm lightly. "Watson, note how grief blinds our client. He sees guilt where there may be none, yet truth leaves marks more subtle than tears. Did you perceive the faint abrasion on Phelps's cuff? That was no dust of sweeping it, was emery, and his heart leaped when I spoke of the ledger." "Then you do suspect him?" I asked. I suspect him of knowledge, which is not the same as guilt, but knowledge is the door to guilt, and guilt the key to truth. We must open them in their proper order. The fog still pressed against the panes as we descended to the waiting cab. Holmes, lost in thought, fingered the ribbon scrap like a musician seeking the right note. At last he said, "Watson, we shall divide the play. Lestrade will thunder in Drury Lane. You and I will listen, tonight, at Montague Street, for I would wager my violin that the attic has yet one more performance to show us, and perhaps the curtain will rise upon a player we have not yet seen." The remainder of that afternoon passed in a curious hush, as though the house itself held its breath. Joseph Grieve remained in the drawing-room, sunk in the double fog of grief and bewilderment, while Lestrade departed with a ledger under his arm, intent upon wringing cents from the dealer in Drury Lane. Holmes, however, was not a man to sit idly by. He spent a restless hour pacing the length of the hall, peering into alcoves, testing the fastenings of doors, even running his fingers along the carved balusters of the staircase as though wood might confess what men would not. At last he beckoned me aside, his eyes glinting. "Watson, note the dust upon the topmost rail. Disturbed in a place no hand would rest. Someone leaned here recently, perhaps to watch below without being seen. The play has more audience than actors, I think." As twilight came creeping, Holmes arranged with the butler that we should remain in the house overnight. Our client was to overcome, to object, and indeed he seemed relieved at the prospect of companionship. Supper was laid, but little of it eaten, and when the household retired, Holmes and I took our station in the shadows of the landing, just below the attic trap. The air there was still and carried that faint mineral temps which had so struck me earlier. It seemed to cling about one's throat like cobweb. Holmes crouched against the wall, every line of him taut with expectation. "Mark me, Watson," he whispered. "The guilty seldom resist revisiting their scene. Whether out of pride, fear, or some grotesque sentiment, they return. We shall see if our phantom honors tradition." The house fell silent but for the ticking of a bracket clock below. The hours wore on. My limbs grew stiff, and I had begun to doubt the wisdom of our vigil when a faint creak reached my ears. Holmes's hand, icy and strong, pressed upon my wrist. We listened. Steps, light and deliberate, came up the back stair. Then a pause. Then the ghost of a scrape against wood, the sound of a shoe removed, or perhaps replaced. The knob of the landing door turned slowly. Through the gloom the figure of Phelps the valet emerged, the candle shaded by his palm. He moved with practiced silence toward the cord that dangled from the ceiling. Holmes, crouched low, gave no sign of movement. Phelps pulled once, and the hatch descended with its sigh. He mounted swiftly, the candle held high. Vanishing into the attic, Holmes touched my arm, and together we followed, noiseless as shadows. At the top we beheld a strange sight. The valet had set the candle upon the trunk and was kneeling before it, lifting the lid with the reverence of a priest. From within he drew forth not clothing nor relics but 3 masks, white and blank as death, each tied with ribbon. He laid them side by side upon the boards. One bore a numeral, scrawled in ink, I another, 2, the third, 3. Holmes's breath caught, though he spoke not. Phelps touched each mask in turn, then pressed his forehead against them as if in desperate prayer. Suddenly he froze. A board had creaked beneath my boot, faint but fatal. The valet leaped to his feet, the candle guttering, his face contorted in terror. Holmes stepped forward. "Be still, Phelps. We have seen enough." The man's composure shattered. He clutched the masks to his chest, backing against the wall. "You don't understand," he stammered, voice cracked. "I meant no harm. It was for him, for Sir Alister. He demanded it, he insisted." Holmes's tone was cool and precise. "Your master demanded to die with a mask upon his face. An odd request. Pray enlighten us." Phelps's eyes darted to the trapdoor as though escape might yet be contrived. But Holmes had already positioned himself between. He said they completed the circle, the valet whispered. "He swore the collection was unfinished until he wore the last. He bade me fetch the ledger, bade me keep the servants from prying. He said only I must help him tie the ribbon, hold the lamp. I begged him not to. He forced my hand. And so you tied the mask upon him," Holmes said evenly, and in the moment he collapsed. "What then?" "I thought he swooned," Phelps muttered. "I tried to tear the ribbon, to free him. It broke, see, it broke jagged. But he was gone already. I could not call out, not with the others rushing up. I shut the hatch and fled down the back stair. When they found him, I was in my room. I never meant." Holmes regarded him with a gaze that could have cleaved iron. "You never meant to kill, yet you meant to conceal. That distinction may weigh little with the law, but it is everything to truth. Tell me, what significance had these masks for Sir Alister?" Phelps shook his head violently. "I do not know. Only that he said they belonged to his father's regiment, that there had been a rite, a vow. He feared it, yet he longed for it. The last mask would complete him," he said. "I swear I know no more." Holmes stooped, lifting one of the masks with delicate fingers. The candlelight made its blankness dreadful, its vacant gaze more human than any face. "Numbered," he murmured, "but not by a soldier's hand. Roman numerals, ink fresh within the month. These were arranged for effect, not for tradition. Someone wished your master to believe in a destiny, and you were the instrument. The valet crumpled, sobbing against the boards. Holmes replaced the mask and straightened, his expression unreadable. He motioned me to help Phelps to his feet. "We shall let Inspector Lestrade test your tale," Holmes said coldly. "But mark this, you are a pawn, not the player. The true hand remains hidden, and it is that hand which tied more than a ribbon about Sir Alister's throat." As we descended, I could not shake the chill that clung to me. Holmes bore the 3 masks wrapped in his cloak, his eyes gleaming with the fire of a puzzle half revealed. In the hall below, he turned to me. "Watson, tonight we have glimpsed the shadow behind the curtain. Tomorrow, when Lestrade returns from Drury Lane, we may yet name the playwright. Morning light, pale and unforgiving, filtered through the curtains of Montague Street when Lestrade returned, his boots sharp upon the flagstones. He carried under his arm not only the ledger but another parcel, brown-papered and sealed with wax, which he laid upon the table as if it burned him." Holmes, who had not slept but had instead spent the night arranging the 3 masks upon a chair and contemplating them as if they might speak, sprang upright with all the vigor of a man refreshed. "Well, Inspector," he demanded. Lestrade rubbed at his temples. "I've had my share of odd tales, Holmes, but this is a new chapter. That dealer, Sayer, swore blind he never sold Sir Alister any mask. He admits to supplying the ledger, but says it was at Sir Alister's request and held nothing more unusual than his past purchases. Yet a woman came to his shop 2 weeks ago, face veiled. Voiceland left instructions for a delivery to Sir Alister. She paid in gold sovereigns. The parcel contained one of those very masks. Sayer insists he thought it some theatrical trifle." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "And this parcel, it came this morning, addressed to Sir Alister, though he lies in his coffin. Same hand as on the ledger entry. Sayer believes. My men intercepted it at the sorting office." Holmes broke the seal with a flick of his knife. Within lay another mask, white as the rest, but across its forehead was scrawled in bold ink the numeral 4. The sight of it seemed to draw the air from the room. Grieve, who had hovered pale in the corner, gave a strangled gasp. For Holmes said softly, almost to himself, "The set is not 3, but 4, and the last was intended to arrive after the baronet was already dead. How obliging of our enemy to complete the count for us." Lestrade's face was grim. "So it's no accident. Somebody meant this collection to hound him." "Meant not only to hound," Holmes corrected, "meant to convince him of inevitability. Consider, Watson, first mask, second, third, and now a 4th, arriving like steps in a ritual. Sir Alister was persuaded he must enact the final scene. Our culprit is no crude murderer with rope or knife, but a playwright who uses fear as his weapon." Grieve pressed trembling hands to his brow. "But why? Who would torment my brother, sir?" Holmes studied him with a peculiar intensity, then turned to Lestrade. "What of Phelps? Held in custody," Lestrade replied. "He sticks to his story that Sir Alister forced him to tie the mask. I don't know whether to call him liar or simpleton, but he weeps like a child and swears he thought it some private mania. I've half a mind to believe him." "You may believe him in part," said Holmes, "but remember, Lestrade, even pawns have their choice of squares. His silence after the death is damning enough." Holmes laid the 4 masks side by side. The effect was chilling for blank faces, each more dreadful for its emptiness. "Inspector, we must trace that veiled woman. If Sayer spoke truth, she is the courier of this drama." Lestrade grunted. He could describe little. "Smaller figure," he said, and moved with a limp, paid without quibble. At once Holmes's eyes lit with that unmistakable fire. "A limp, Watson. Do you recall? Sir Alister carried a cane without lameness. The cane is missing. I begin to scent the outline of our phantom. Someone meant him to believe he was playing a part already cast stand when he faltered. They hastened the ending." Grieve's voice was hoarse. "You speak of manipulation, Mr. Holmes, but could fear alone strike down a soldier who faced cannon fire?" Holmes stooped over the ledger, flipping back pages with quick, sure hands. "Fear, yes, but fear coupled with suggestion. His father's regiment, rites of masks, whispers of unfinished vows. It is the old story of superstition used as weapon. A man may be braver on a battlefield than in his own attic. When he thinks ghosts demand his heart." Lestrade folded his arms. "So where does that leave us? A valet who trembles, a woman in a veil, and a baronet who frightened himself into the grave." "Not frightened himself," Holmes corrected. "He was assisted." He tapped the mask marked 4. "This arrival proves premeditation beyond doubt. Our quarry is clever, but not yet clever enough. They left us a trail of numbers, and numbers, Watson, never lie." We followed Holmes into the library, where he spread the ledger, masks, and parcel upon a long mahogany table. He bent over them, muttering, then suddenly straightened with a decisive gesture. "Inspector, bring me ink and paper. I would reconstruct the sequence." In a flurry of strokes he drew 4 squares, marking them eye to eye. See here. Sir Alister acquires the first, then the second, then the third, each at intervals. The 4th is sent after his death, to assure us that his end was indeed the closing act. But here lies the flaw. The numerals are not consistent with the entries in his own hand. Look at his writing, rounded, elegant. These are angular, hurried, as though added by a different pen entirely. We are dealing with a falsifier who wished to impose a sense of destiny upon the baronet. Greaves' face contorted with pain. Then his terror was contrived. Someone preyed upon his weakness. Precisely, Holmes said. Which means our question is not who profited by his death in the ordinary sense, but who had knowledge of his fears and the ingenuity to exploit them. That circle is narrower than you think. Holmes strode to the window, threw back the curtain, and gazed into the morning fog where the city went about its indifferent business. Watson, this is no common crime. We must trace its threads not merely through shops and ledgers, but through memory, through family, through the very marrow of a man's past. For somewhere in that past, someone lit the match that kindled last night's horror. Lestrade tapped the ledger impatiently. Well, Holmes, where do we begin? Holmes turned back, eyes burning. With the regiment of Sir Alister's father, if masks were ever more than fancy, the root lies there. You will obtain the roll of officers and surviving men. I will question those who knew Sir Alister best. Between us, we shall strip the disguise from our phantom. As he spoke, the 4 masks lay in their dreadful row, their vacant gazes fixed upon us. For the first time I felt that peculiar dread which comes not from blood nor blade, but from the thought that a man may be destroyed as surely by illusion as by iron. And I knew that until the author of this cruel theatre was unmasked, none of us could look upon those faces without shuddering. Holmes wasted no time in putting his plan into action. Lestrade, grumbling but obedient, departed with orders to secure the regimental records, while Holmes and I accompanied Joseph Grieve back to his townhouse, where he insisted on producing whatever letters and family documents might assist. The cab jolted through the fog, its wheels sounding hollow on the cobbles, and Holmes sat with the ledger open across his knees, his gaze darting from the inked numerals to the margins, then to some point beyond the window where his thoughts ranged freely. When we arrived, Grieve led us into a dim study whose shelves sagged under the weight of old correspondence, military treatises, and ledgers of estate business. He set a small bundle of letters upon the desk, faded envelopes, their edges foxed with age. These were my father's, he said. He seldom spoke of the Crimea, but in his later years he began to write down fragments of memory. Alister treasured them. Perhaps there is mention of masks. Holmes's long fingers flicked through the stack until he paused at one creased sheet. He read aloud, a curious diversion among the men, faces cut from card, daubed white, tied with ribbon, a means perhaps of laughing at fear. Yet some wore them at night in earnest, muttering of vows to be fulfilled. I forbade it, though a few persisted. Holmes laid the paper flat and tapped it. There is our seed. What began as soldier's jest ripened into ritual. Your father, Sir Alister's father, sought to quell it, but the impression upon his son remained. Grieve swallowed hard. So Alister inherited a superstition, nurtured it into obsession. But who could have known? Someone who stood close enough to hear the whispers, Holmes replied, and someone who knew how to fan embers into flame. The veiled woman, perhaps, or one who employed her. We must ask ourselves who profits from Sir Alister's death, not only in the state but in silence, I ventured. You mean to suggest a family motive? Holmes's expression softened, but his tone was precise. I mean to suggest that superstition is seldom fatal unless guided. Your brother's death was theatre, Watson, and every play demands a playwright. We must discover who wrote his lines. At that moment the butler appeared with news. Inspector Lestrade had returned and awaited us below, bearing papers from the War Office. Holmes swept the masks into a black bag, gathered the ledger, and led the way. Lestrade spread his sheaf upon the dining table. Here's the muster roll of Colonel Grieve's regiment. Most are long dead, but a handful of survivors remain. To live here in London, Sergeant Bramwell in Lambeth and a Captain Dorrington in Kensington. Both saw service in the Crimea. I've already sent word for them to attend us if possible. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Excellent. Let us begin with Captain Dorrington. A man of rank may have preserved more than memory. By early afternoon we were shown into a modest but respectable house in Kensington, where an elderly gentleman received us. Captain Dorrington was tall still, though stooped, with eyes that had stared long at horizons and hands that trembled when they rested. At the mention of Sir Alister, he sighed deeply. I knew him as a lad running underfoot at the barracks, he said. His father feared the regiment's foolish rites might stain him. Masks, indeed. Mere nonsense invented by weary men, yet it bred unease, I grant you. I myself saw soldiers muttering behind those blank faces, swearing oaths in the candlelight. Your late Sir Alister would have been told. And boys never forget what is half forbidden. Holmes showed him one of the white masks. Dorrington recoiled. That is no relic of our time. Ours were crude chalk on card. This is newer, fashioned with care. Who dares pass such a thing as relic of the regiment? Precisely, Captain, Holmes said. You confirm my suspicion. These are not memories but forgeries, crafted to ensnare a man haunted by memory. Whoever sent them knew enough of the regiment's folly to make their deception credible. We left Dorrington pale and shaking, yet grateful that the matter might be exposed. Outside, Holmes pressed my arm. We draw closer, Watson. Consider. Someone with knowledge of the Grieve household and the regiment's past. Someone who could manipulate fear with theatrical flourish. The field narrows. If our pawn Phelps knew of it, he learned it from another. As dusk drew near, we returned to Montague Street, where Sergeant Bramwell awaited us in the parlor, a stout fellow with a soldier's blunt bearing. His face, scarred and ruddy, bore the look of one who had lived hard and drunk harder. He rose with stiff courtesy. "You ask about masks, sir. I remember them. A foolishness we thought buried. But if Sir Alister's death is tied to them, then I'll speak plain. There was one among us who took it seriously, obsessively so. A corporal named Ellery, he muttered, of 4 faces, of vows unfinished. He swore one day the sons of officers would wear them as we did. He frightened even grown men." "Ellery," Holmes repeated. "What became of him?" "Discharged with disgrace," Bramwell said. "Drunkenness, insolence, desertion. Vanished from the rolls. Some said he stayed in London. I thought him long dead." Holmes's gaze sharpened to a "Not dead, Sergeant. Only waiting. Our phantom playwright has a name." Back in the carriage, Holmes sat taut as a bowstring, the city's lamps flickering across his gaunt face. "Watson, we must learn whether this Ellery yet lives. If so, he has woven his vengeance with thread of fear, binding the son of his colonel to a destiny he invented. And if he employed a veiled woman, she is but his herald." He closed his eyes a moment, then added, "We are upon the edge of the truth. Tonight we shall watch more closely than ever, for I suspect the 4th mask was not the end, but the summons to the true revelation." His hand closed over the bag that held the 4 masks, and for an instant I thought them shift, as though the blank faces pressed outward, eager to witness the unmasking of the living culprit who had set them upon their ghastly stage. That evening the fog pressed low upon Montague Street, as though the city itself leaned close to overhear the last acts of this macabre play. Holmes had contrived a plan with his usual brisk assurance, though he revealed little of its detail. Lestrade, still skeptical but sufficiently impressed by the trail of masks and the spectre of Corporal Ellery, agreed to place constables in plain clothes at discreet points about the house. Phelps, under guard, remained in custody, while Joseph Grieve hovered in a state of exhausted dread. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated. He moved about the house with quick, precise gestures, testing doors, peering into the corners of the attic, even marking the boards with a stick of chalk in symbols only he understood. At length he turned to me with that gleam in his eye which was both invitation and command. "Watson, tonight we shall bait the trap. These masks were never meant merely to torment. They were meant to be seen in use, to enforce a ritual. If Ellery or his agent believes the play unfinished, he may risk revealing himself to complete it. You and I must be the audience, and perhaps the final performers." I knew better than to protest. When Holmes spoke in such tones, resistance was as useless as arguing with the tide. At his direction we arranged the 4 masks upon the trunk in the attic, setting a lamp nearby to cast their blank gazes into the gloom. He then produced from his pocket a 5th mask, hastily fashioned from card and chalk. "Our intruder believes he commands the script," Holmes murmured, "but theatre is most dangerous when the players improvise." As night deepened, we concealed ourselves. Holmes crouched near the window, myself by the hatch, while Lestrade and 2 men waited on the landing below. The house settled into that uncanny stillness which precedes either sleep or calamity. I confess my pulse quickened with every creak of timber, every sigh of the draught. It was past midnight when the sound came soft at first, then distinct the stealthy tread upon the stair. Holmes's eyes glinted in the lamplight, and his hand motioned me to silence. The trapdoor stirred, opened, and a figure rose slowly into view. The intruder wore a cloak. His shoulders stooped, his gait marked by the faint irregularity of a limp. In one hand he carried a cane, in the other a small parcel. His face was hidden by a veil of coarse black cloth. He advanced to the trunk, set down the parcel, and with ritual solemnity laid a mask beside the others. This one bore the numeral V. He raised his arms as if invoking unseen witnesses, muttering words too low to catch. Then, from within his cloak, he drew another mask and held it toward the shadows. "Come forth," he hissed, voice cracked and aged. "The vow is not complete. The son of Grieve must wear it. The circle must close." Holmes stepped forward, then, swift as a striking hawk, in one motion he tore away the veil and clamped a hand upon the man's wrist. A cry escaped the intruder, half snarl, half groan, and the candlelight fell upon a face ravaged by years but unmistakably human. "Ellery," Holmes said. "Corporal Ellery, late of the regiment. You have kept your vow, but not in the way you imagined." The old soldier struggled, his eyes wild, but Lestrade and his men burst through the hatch, seizing him with practiced force. The masks scattered across the floor like ghastly playing cards. Even then Ellery's voice rose in cracked triumph. "He wore it. He wore the 3rd. He died as promised. You cannot deny the vow is fulfilled." Holmes regarded him coldly. "What you call a vow was superstition. You forged the numerals, sent the masks, preyed upon a man's weakness. You killed with fear Ellery, though your hands bear no blood, and you would have forced another, his brother, perhaps to follow, but your theatre is ended. The man sagged in his captor's grip, muttering incoherently of oaths and faces, until Lestrade signaled for him to be dragged away. Silence returned to the attic, broken only by the faint rattle of the masks as the draft stirred them. Holmes stooped and gathered the fallen pieces. "Observe, Watson, the numbering is crude. The ink recent." Ellery thought to weave destiny, but he betrayed himself with every stroke of his pen. Had Sir Alister's heart been stronger, the farce would have failed. As it was, fear did what steel could not. Joseph Grieve appeared then, pale and shaken, having forced himself up the stair when the commotion began. He stared at the scene, his gaze fixed upon the discarded masks. "So my brother died of a lie," he whispered. "A cruel invention." Holmes placed a hand upon his shoulder, uncharacteristically gentle. "He died of a fear too long nurtured, sir, but you may take some comfort. The hand that wielded it is unmasked, and the play is ended." As we descended into the quiet house, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, thin and tentative. Holmes walked with the weary grace of a man whose mind had run at full stretch and now eased. "Watson," he murmured, "fear is the subtlest poison of all. It leaves no wound upon the flesh, but it gnaws at the soul until even the stoutest heart falters. Our task was not merely to unmask a criminal, but to prove that illusion is not fate. It is a lesson I trust we both shall not forget." And with that he turned, the bag of masks swinging lightly at his side, as though he carried nothing more than trifles, while behind us the last echoes of Ellery's delusion faded into the London dawn. The following morning, Holmes and I sat once more in the familiar warmth of Baker Street, the fog outside thinning into ribbons that clung to the lampposts like the remnants of a torn shroud. Mrs. Hudson brought in coffee and a plate of toast, which Holmes waved aside with absent disdain. He was sunk deep into his armchair, the black bag of masks upon the table before him, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Lestrade had departed at dawn, his prisoner under escort to Scotland Yard, but Holmes had refused rest until we were returned home. Now he regarded the masks as though they were chessmen in some morbid game, his gaze never wavering from their blank faces. "At last, Watson," he said at length, "the curtain has fallen. Yet there remains the matter of the playwright's motive. Ellery was a soldier, discharged in disgrace, but hatred alone seldom sustains a man for decades. He might rail against the Grieves, but why construct this theatre of masks?" I sipped my coffee. He spoke of vows, of promises broken. Perhaps superstition had devoured what remained of his reason. "Madness is motive enough." Holmes, he shook his head sharply. "Madness, yes, but guided madness. Even lunacy has its logic. Ellery did not work alone. The veiled woman, the careful delivery of the parcels, the forged entries in the ledger, these are acts of precision, not delirium. Someone employed Ellery's obsession as tool for their own design. The thought unsettled me. But if he has confessed to the deed, he has confessed to the performance, Watson, not to the authorship. I smelled violets in that attic. Remember, Ellery reeks of spirits and smoke, not perfume. No, there is another player who remains hidden, and I fear their hand has not yet been stayed." At that moment the bell rang, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in Joseph Grieve. He looked older by a decade, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He bowed to Holmes with weary gratitude. "I came to thank you, Mr. Holmes. The news of Ellery's capture brings some relief. Yet I cannot shake the dread that my brother's death is not wholly explained." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You are correct, sir. Tell me, have you enemies? Debts, rivalries, disputes over the estate?" Grieve shook his head. "None that I know of. Alister and I were reclusive by choice. Our only dealings were with collectors and dealers." He hesitated, then added, "Though I recall one, a lady who approached Alister some months ago. She professed to own items once belonging to our father's regiment." He was intrigued, but after one meeting he grew pale and forbade me to mention her again. He never spoke her name. Holmes's eyes glowed with sudden fire. "A lady, you say? Small of stature, a limp perhaps concealed?" Grieve faltered. "Yes, she walked with a stick." "How did you—" Holmes rose abruptly, pacing the room with restless energy. "Watson, the veiled woman is no mere emissary. She is the architect. Ellery was but her puppet, chosen for his weakness and obsession. She placed the masks before him, guided his delusion, and through him reached Sir Alister. And who gains most now that both baronet and valet are removed from the stage?" Grieve's face blanched. "Removed. But Phelps still lives." Holmes stopped short, his gaze piercing. "Lives for the moment. But mark me, sir, if this woman's design is inheritance, then her path lies through you. It is you she will seek to unnerve next. The play is not ended, it merely changes its lead." Grieve staggered to a chair. His breath quickened. "You mean I am to be the next victim?" Holmes laid a hand upon his shoulder, firm and steady. "Not if I may prevent it. But you must have courage, Mr. Grieve. The mask is meant to terrify. We shall turn it against its master. Return home, behave as usual, and await what comes. Watson and I shall remain near." By afternoon we were once more in Montague Street, though now the atmosphere was heavier still, as though the house itself sensed the danger lurking at its threshold. Holmes examined every entry point with fastidious care, scattering his chalk symbols anew, then settled into the drawing-room with his violin. He drew the bow across the strings, softly, the notes winding through the gloom like a spell to summon shadows. Hours passed. Grieve dozed fitfully in a chair, his face slack with exhaustion. I kept watch at the window, while Holmes played on with tireless patience. At last, near midnight, a faint knock came at the front door. The butler, roused from his bed, admitted a messenger who bore a small package wrapped in brown paper. Holmes intercepted it before Grieve's hands could touch it. He turned it over, sniffed the faint trace of violets, then slit it open with his knife. Inside lay yet another mask, identical to the others, but this one bore no numeral. Instead, across the forehead in a delicate feminine hand was written a single word. Now, Grieve gave a choking cry. Holmes's jaw tightened. "So the curtain rises again," he murmured. "But this time, Watson, the theater shall play to our script, not hers." He closed the parcel, his eyes alight with grim determination. The lady reveals herself at last. Her hand is in the writing, her perfume in the ribbon, her cunning in the scheme. We shall answer her summons, but on our own terms. Tomorrow, Watson, we must discover her name. For until the author of this mask is unmasked, no man in Montague Street shall sleep in peace. The masks lay upon the table, their vacant eyes reflecting the lamplight. I thought then, with a shiver, that the cruelest disguise was not the white faces before us but the hidden woman who moved unseen, directing the whole grim play. And in Holmes's rigid stance, I knew he had resolved to drag her into the open, whatever peril it required. The dawn after the arrival of that final mask found Holmes already in motion. He had not slept, nor had he touched so much as a cup of tea, but sat with his long frame hunched at the writing table, pen scratching furiously across paper. The mask marked now lay at his elbow, a pale sentinel over his calculations. When I entered bleary-eyed from a brief and uneasy rest, he glanced up with peculiar brightness in his gaze which signaled both fatigue and triumph. "Watson, the hand that penned that word is not unknown to me," he said. "See the slope of the letters, particularly the curl of the N. I compared it with half a dozen notes from our files last night. Do you recall the case of Lady Venn and the disputed miniature? The anonymous correspondence that nearly ruined her? The hand is the same, and if I am not mistaken, we now deal with the same authoress, Miss Claudia Mer—" I asked, remembering a small, sharp-faced woman who had skirted the edge of scandal. "The very one," Holmes replied, "a woman of talent and bitterness, skilled at imitating documents. Once enamored of Sir Alister and dismissed with contempt, she bore him a grudge, and I dare say she found in Ellery the perfect instrument, half-crazed, steeped in memories of masks and vows. Between them they fashioned this theatre of terror. He supplied the superstition, she the cunning. Together they drove your poor baronet to his grave." Before I could reply, a knock sounded below, followed by a hurried step. Moments later Lestrade entered, flushed from haste. He carried a sheet of paper stamped with the seal of the yard. "Holmes, I've news. Our prisoner Ellery hanged himself in his cell last night, left no confession. Only ramblings about the vow completed, and the lady will finish the work." Holmes received this without surprise. As I anticipated, Ellery was not master of himself, nor of this crime. His death was inevitable once his purpose was served. But his words confirmed that danger remains. The lady will finish the work. Lestrade and Joseph Grieve is her intended quarry. Grieve, summoned quickly to Baker Street, arrived white and trembling. Holmes steadied him with a gesture. "Courage, sir. Your enemy is flesh and blood, not phantom. We know her name, and today we shall smoke her out. She is bold enough to send a summons. She will be bolder yet to attend her own drama." By mid-morning we were on our way to Bloomsbury, where Miss Claudia Merivale kept a narrow house filled, as Holmes explained, with curiosities and scraps of antiquarian trade. The street was modest but respectable, its iron railings glistening with dew. Lestrade had arranged for men to wait at either end. Holmes and I went to the door, Grieve reluctantly behind us. It was opened by the lady herself. She was smaller than memory painted her, with sharp features softened by age but not by kindness. She leaned upon a cane, and in her other hand she carried a sprig of violets whose scent drifted unmistakably to us. She started at sight of Grieve, then recovered with a smile as thin as parchment. "Why, Mr. Grieve," she said, her voice low and steady. "How good of you to call. I was about to send for you. There is a matter of inheritance we must discuss." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes like flint. "Indeed, madam, inheritance in masks and in fear. Shall we speak within?" She admitted us without protest, leading to a parlor cluttered with books, boxes, and the odd theatrical mask hung as decoration. Holmes surveyed the room once, then set the parcel containing the 4 masks upon the table. When he unwrapped them, Miss Merivale's composure faltered. "You recognize them," Holmes said, her lips tightened. "I recognize justice. Sir Alister scorned me. He scorned others. He lived surrounded by grotesques and yet could not see the grotesque in himself. I gave him what he craved, the completion of his collection. By employing Ellery," Holmes pressed. She lifted her chin. "He was willing. His mind burned with old oaths. I merely gave them shape. Do you call that crime? It was art, a performance, and it succeeded, did it not?" Grieve gave a strangled cry. But Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "You mistake cruelty for artistry, madam. You preyed upon a weakness, turned memory into weapon, and drove a man to death. Ellery is gone, but you remain, and the law will find its hold upon you." Her eyes blazed. "The law cannot touch me. I tied no ribbon, struck no blow. What proof have you beyond masks and memories?" Holmes's smile was thin, merciless. "The proof of your own hand. Madam, you penned the word now upon the last mask. Your script is unique. Your perfume clings to its ribbon. More than that, this very cane you lean upon belonged to Sir Alister, taken from his attic the night he died. You could not resist the trophy. Inspector, I believe you have your evidence." Lestrade, who had been waiting in the doorway, stepped forward with his men. At the sight of them, Miss Mirabelle Barbado collapsed. She shrieked once, a sound like tearing silk, then crumpled into her chair, the violets falling from her hand as she was taken away. Grieve turned to Holmes with gratitude and anguish mingled. "You have saved me, Mr. Holmes, at the cost of my brother dead." Our name entwined with madness. Holmes touched his shoulder lightly. "Better truth with grief than ignorance with terror. You are free now, sir, to live unmasked. See that you do." When at last we returned to Baker Street, Holmes dropped heavily into his chair, lighting his pipe with a weary air. "Watson," he said, "this case is a reminder that the deadliest weapons are not steel or shot, but illusions planted in a fertile mind. Ellery was but the instrument. Miss Mirabelle wielded him as she would a pen, and nearly wrote tragedy upon another man's life. But illusions crumble when faced with light, and our task was to provide it." I nodded, watching the smoke curl upward, and reflected, as I often did, that while the world might see only a detective unraveling puzzles, I had seen again the rare courage that guarded against terrors no bullet could repel. The masks lay upon the table, blank and silent at last. Their dreadful theatre concluded, yet in Holmes's eyes I glimpsed the faintest shadow of melancholy, as though he alone understood that there will always be another curtain, another stage, another hidden face awaiting revelation. The trial of Miss Claudia Merivale was not long in coming. The evidence Holmes had gathered proved damning enough for the magistrates to commit her for conspiracy and malicious harassment, though the charge of murder could not be pressed where no hand had dealt a blow. Ellery's death in his cell deprived the court of a co-conspirator, but his ramblings and Holmes's reconstruction of events formed a net too tight for her wriggling. She went to prison unrepentant, her lips still curling at the notion that she had written a play and all London had watched its final act. In the weeks that followed, Joseph Grieve struggled to reclaim his composure. He came often to Baker Street, sometimes to consult Holmes on the settlement of his brother's affairs, sometimes only to sit in silence, staring at the fire as though he feared masks might materialize there. Holmes treated him with a brusque kindness, offering no sympathy in words but ensuring that the practical knots of the estate were swiftly untangled. "It is occupation the man requires, Watson," Holmes told me once, "not the damp hand of condolence. Grief evaporates quicker when the mind is put to work." One evening, as winter pressed its fingers against the panes and the fire roared in the grate, Holmes at last consented to set aside his papers and speak freely of the case. He leaned back, pipe glowing red, his eyes half closed in that cat-like repose which could turn, in a heartbeat, to lightning activity. "You see, Watson," he began, "this affair was never truly about masks at all. They were but instruments, a language chosen for their resonance with Sir Alister's mind. Ellery alone could never have forged such a scheme. He lacked the subtlety. But Miss Mirabelle, she saw how superstition clings where logic is weakest, how a child's memory of soldiers whispering behind crude disguises might blossom into an adult's terror. She constructed a mythology around him, fed him tokens at intervals, each mask another rung upon the ladder of dread. When he reached the top, his heart failed him, a more efficient killing than any knife. I shivered, though the fire was warm. "You mean, then, that she calculated his death as precisely as any assassin?" "Just so. She required no weapon but time, no accomplice but a disordered veteran. Ellery lent the performance its authenticity. He believed the vow. He believed destiny demanded fulfillment. Merivale knew that belief would infect Sir Alister, and thus it did." Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate, the ash falling like grey snow. "It is an instructive lesson, Watson, on the power of suggestion. Men boast of their courage until the invisible enemy is set upon them. One cannot parry a ghost. I thought of Sir Alister collapsing beneath the hatch, a blank mask upon his face, and felt the familiar weight of futility that sometimes lingered after even the most brilliant resolution. "Still, Holmes," I said, "what justice is there when a man's end is contrived without mark or wound? The law may cage the schemer, but the dead remain beyond its reach." Holmes's gaze softened, and for a rare moment he seemed less the machine of deduction than a man aware of tragedy's weight. "True, my dear fellow, but truth, once laid bare, robs cruelty of its triumph. Sir Alister did not fall to fate or phantom, but to the design of a woman whose bitterness consumed her, in knowing that his brother is freed of the same snare. That is justice of a kind." We fell into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last Holmes rose, restless once more, and fetched his violin. The notes he drew were neither triumphant nor mournful. but something in between a meditation upon shadows dispersed yet never wholly gone. When he set the instrument aside, he remarked almost carelessly, "I trust you have recorded this case with the thoroughness it deserves, Watson. It is unlikely to be surpassed for grotesque ingenuity. Yet I advise you, when you write it for the public, temper the more theatrical elements. The good people of London may enjoy their mysteries, but we must not feed their appetite for phantoms. Let them remember that reason, not superstition. Unmasks the villain." I promised him as much, though I knew even stripped of embellishment, the tale would chill any reader. For myself, I could not banish the image of those white faces, blank yet brimming with menace, nor the thought that somewhere beyond our walls there might lurk other weaving other illusions for unwary minds. Holmes, however, seemed already to have dismissed the matter. He filled his pipe anew, stretched his legs toward the fire, and with that curious mixture of arrogance and wariness declared, "The case of the mask hidden in the attic is concluded, Watson. The masks are consigned to Scotland Yard's evidence room, and may they moulder there forgotten. London has fresh puzzles enough without resurrecting old phantoms." And so it ended. Yet as I left him to his smoke and shadows that night, I could not help but feel that the masks had left their imprint not only upon the Grieve household but upon Holmes himself. Though he would never confess it, he had triumphed over deceit, as ever. But even he could not deny that the blank faces had stared back at him with something more than plaster and ribbon. They had reminded us both that the most dangerous disguises are not those worn upon the face, but those that dwell in memory. And feared it was some weeks later, in the lull of a rainy March afternoon, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more at peace in Baker Street. The newspapers had long since consigned the affair of the masks to their archives, though here and there a sensational column still spoke of the Mascaragi murder, weaving it into some Gothic legend. For the public's amusement, Holmes, of course, paid no heed to such embellishment. He had moved on to other matters, his violin once more filling the rooms with fits of melody, his pipe sending up its familiar smoke wreaths. Yet I could not dismiss the memory so lightly. Joseph Grieve had written to us, his letter trembling with gratitude. With the estate secured and the menace of Miss Merivale removed, he intended to leave London for the quiet of the country, where he might rebuild his life far from the stage of terror upon which his brother had fallen. He begged Holmes to visit, but Holmes, ever reluctant to linger among reminders of past cases, merely smiled and consigned the letter to a drawer. "A man who seeks peace, Watson," he remarked, "is better left to find it without the stir of my presence." The masks themselves remained at Scotland Yard, sealed away as evidence. Lestrade, who had gained no small credit for the arrest, paid us a visit to gloat in his modest fashion, though he admitted freely enough that Holmes had been the true hand behind the resolution. Holmes received him with the courteous disdain he reserved for allies of limited imagination, and when Lestrade departed, he remarked dryly, "The Yard will never know whether it was superstition or science that solved the case, but we may be content that truth stands firm even when cloaked in theatre." I pressed him then, as I often did when a case had run its course. "Holmes, tell me one thing. Did you ever feel, even for a moment, the chill of that superstition yourself?" The masks seemed to carry a presence beyond their making. He looked at me keenly, then allowed a rare smile. "My dear Watson, I felt the chill of fear, but not for myself. Fear is a contagion. Place a mask upon a wall, whisper vows and destinies, and even a rational mind may begin to wonder. Sir Alistair was undone not by phantoms but by suggestion. My task was not to resist the mask, but to strip it of its power, and once exposed it was nothing more than card and ribbon." His words comforted me, though I could not wholly rid myself of the impression that those blank faces had stared into something deeper than reason. Yet Holmes, with his usual detachment, had already dismissed them. Turning his thoughts to the telegram he now unfolded from the table, he read it, tapped the paper against his knee, and his eyes lit with fresh interest. "Another puzzle calls, Watson," he said briskly. "A banker in Threadneedle Street finds his vault mysteriously filled, not emptied. Curious, is it not? Come, we shall see what lies behind abundance." And so, as ever, the world moved forward. The case of the mask hidden in the attic receded into memory, its grotesque theatre closed, its actors unmasked, but I knew I would carry its image for years to come. Sir Alistair fallen with the mask upon his face, Ellery raving of vows in his cell, Miss Merivale clutching her violets in defiance, and Holmes standing amid it all, calm and inexorable, as reason's torchbearer against the shadows. Thus ended one of the strangest of our adventures, a tale that proved, more than most, the truth of Holmes's philosophy, that illusion can kill as surely as steel, but that no illusion can withstand the light of observation. And if ever I doubted, I had only to look upon my friend, his gaze clear and unwavering, ready always for the next enigma that London's fog might conceal. Always